The wildest thing about El Ascenso de la Reina Licántropa is that it doesn't just want you to root for a girl to take her throne back. It wants you to sit there, quietly, uncomfortably, and admit you understand what it feels like to be born wrong in a world that treats bloodline like oxygen. And then it dares you to watch her come back 20 years later, not as a sob story, but as a problem, as a living correction, as the kind of legend people only tolerate when it stays in the old songs, safely trapped behind Once Upon a Time. I'm talking full spoilers today, because pretending we can dance around the big turns in a show like this is just not my idea of fun, and it's definitely not honest. This is flick flair, and I have been living with this drama in my head like it pays rent. If you want more long-form, spoiler-heavy drama therapy sessions like this, consider subscribing. So, a Silver Moon Wolf princess, born without power, exiled, and then, after 2 decades of everyone congratulating themselves for solving the inconvenient child, she returns as the legendary Lycan Queen to claim her lineage, avenge her mother, and rewrite the laws of the Wolf Kingdom. That premise alone could have been a standard-issue fantasy revenge machine. You know the model: humiliation, training montage, glow-up, slaughter, crown, roll credits. Except this show keeps swerving away from the easy dopamine. It keeps asking, okay, what happens after the comeback? Not the fanfic part. The governing part. The part where you have to legislate your trauma. And I want to start with that born without power choice because it's not just a plot hook. It's the entire emotional engine. The way the drama frames her early life. Again, I'm speaking broadly because the show doesn't rely on one single iconic flashback. It's more like a pattern of memories, makes you feel the constant microviolence of being assessed. Not attacked. Assessed. The looks. The pauses. The ceremonial politeness that hides disgust like perfume. When everyone in your world can smell dominance the way they smell rain, being the one who doesn't register becomes this social death. And the direction understands that. It holds on faces a beat too long. It lets silence curdle. What hit me is how the show refuses to make her powerlessness cute. It's not like, oh, she's different, but special. No, it's treated like a political problem, a succession problem, a religious problem, depending on how your kingdom mythologizes the moon. And that's why the exile lands like a betrayal you can't wash off. Not because exile is dramatic, fantasy exiles are a dime a dozen, but because the show makes it feel like the kingdom is performing surgery on itself, removing the piece that makes their story messy. Here's the question the show keeps sliding across the table, and it's the one that kept me clicking next episode even when my rational brain was like, please, drink water, it's 2 a.m. What does it mean to come back as a legend when you were raised as a mistake? Because that 20-year gap? That's not just time passing. That's mythology doing cardio. People tell stories about you when you're gone. People clean up the timeline. They turn your mother into whatever is most useful. Saint, cautionary tale, martyr, traitor, take your pick. They turn you into a ghost that proves their point. And then you show up alive with opinions. The sheer inconvenience of that is delicious. One of the smart-ass tonal choices is how the drama plays with legendary Reina Licántropa energy. It doesn't hand you the legend in a neat package. It lets the court, and by extension, us, argue about her before she fully arrives. Even when she's physically present, there's this sense that people are looking through her, trying to see the story they were promised. The blocking does a lot of work here. Characters arrange themselves like they're bracing for a natural disaster, not greeting a person. It's ritual defensive posture. And when she steps into those spaces, the air changes. Not because the show hits you with some overcooked slow-motion entrance every time, thank the moon, but because the entire frame tightens. Shoulders rise. Conversations get careful. And I know I'm supposed to be talking about revenge, avenge her mother. But honestly, the revenge is the least interesting part to me. That's my mildly contrarian take. And I'm saying it with love. The vengeance is fuel. It's not the destination. The real drama is the rewriting of laws, because that's where fantasy stories either become shallow, wish fulfillment, or they become uncomfortably real. You can kill a villain and feel clean for a day. You change a system, and you inherit every compromise that system was hiding. There's a moment, more of a recurring type of moment than one single scene, where she's in a space that used to reject her, and she doesn't posture. She doesn't over-explain. She doesn't beg to be recognized. She just stands like someone who has decided her body is not up for debate anymore. The performance sells that with micro-control. The stillness, the way her gaze doesn't skitter even when everyone else's does. It's not girl boss. It's containment. Like she has a storm leashed behind her ribs, and she's choosing, actively choosing, not to let it solve everything. And speaking of storms, the show's relationship with the moon imagery could have been corny. Silver Moon Princes, Wolf Kingdom, laws, lineage. It's all set up for a parade of glowing orbs and lyrical monologues. But what I appreciated is the lighting design tends to keep the moon feeling cold, not romantic. It's metallic. It makes skin look a little paler, a little more exposed. When moonlight hits stone corridors and fur-lined collars, it doesn't feel like destiny. It feels like surveillance. Like the heavens are watching to see if you'll behave. Now, if you're new to this kind of royal beast politics drama, the big seduction is the hierarchy itself. Who stands where? Who speaks first? Who gets to interrupt? El Ascenso de la Reina Licántropa is obsessive about that. The camera will place her lower in the frame when she's being diminished, then gradually stop doing it as she returns to power. Not in a flashy, look at her glow-up way, but in this quiet recentering. It's the kind of visual storytelling that doesn't call attention to itself. It just makes you feel, in your bones, that a room's gravity has changed. And can we talk about the emotional audacity of making her a born without power, and then having her return as the legendary queen? Because the show is basically playing with a spiritual horror. What if the thing your society calls power is not the only kind? What if they measured the wrong metric for generations? That's not just empowering. It's insulting to the people who built their identity on being the standard. This is where the writing gets sharp. The kingdom doesn't just fear her strength. It fears what her existence implies about the legitimacy of the old rules. If a powerless princess can become the queen, if she can rewrite laws, then those laws were never sacred. They were just agreed upon. And nothing makes people more violent than realizing their sacred tradition is actually a group project. Here's what I didn't expect to feel. Grief. Like actual grief. Not just for her mother, whose shadow hangs over the story like a portrait you can't stop noticing, but grief for the child she used to be. There's this ache in how the show frames 20 years later. It's not triumphant. It's costly. You can sense the life she didn't get to live, the relationships she didn't get to have in the open, the softness she didn't get to keep. And I'll be honest, it got under my skin in a way I wasn't prepared for. I had this stupid, small thought while watching. I wonder what parts of me I would have had to cut off to survive a place that wanted me gone. And then I immediately got annoyed at myself for getting that personal over a wolf prince's monarchy drama. But, yeah, that's the point. That's why it works. The show's pacing in the early stretch is patient in a way that might irritate people who want immediate chaos. But that patience is doing something. It's letting you feel how exile becomes a second language. When she returns, she's not just confronting villains. She's confronting the version of herself that learned to expect rejection. You can see it in tiny hesitations, like the body remembering a flinch even when the mind says, "I'm safe now." And the actor, because yes, I'm going to give credit where it's due, plays those hesitations without making them theatrical. It's a blink, a breath held, a jaw tightening and then smoothing over. The kind of work that makes you lean in. Now, the court politics. I can't get into specific named schemers because the input we are working from doesn't give us a roster. And I'm not going to invent a whole cast of Duke Backstab and Lady Side-Eye just for the vibe. But the show clearly populates the palace with archetypes you recognize. The old guard who think they own tradition, the opportunists who smell a new regime, the loyalists who are waiting for her return like a prayer, and the ones caught in the middle who just want the kingdom not to implode. What's good is that the writing doesn't treat them all as cardboard. Even the most frustrating characters often have a logic that tracks. Twisted, self-serving logic. Sure, but it tracks. And that's crucial, because revenge stories die when the antagonists exist purely to be punished. Here, the resistance to her isn't just evil hates good. It's a system defending itself. It's people who built their whole sense of order around a certain story of the world, and she's rewriting the genre in real time. There's a recurring tension between lineage and law that I found genuinely juicy. Claiming her bloodline is one thing. Rewriting the laws is another. A lot of shows would treat law as boring paperwork and lineage as romantic destiny. This drama flips that. Lineage is treated like a trap, like a chain made of expectations, while law becomes the battlefield where you can actually change the future. And every time she pushes for reform, you can feel the room testing her. Is she here to rule? Or is she here to burn it all down? And the delicious answer is, she might be here to do both, depending on what both means. Let me relive one sequence the way it played in my head. Because even if your memory of it is different, you'll know the feeling. It's night, that cold silver blue palette the show loves. And the space is all stone and banners, and the faint suggestion of incense, like the kingdom is trying to perfume its own guilt. She enters a hall where decisions used to be made about her body, her worth, her future. You hear boots on stone, not rushed, not slow motion, just steady. People turn in stages, like the room itself is reluctant to acknowledge her. And the camera doesn't immediately go for a heroic close-up. It stays just far enough away that you can see the geometry. She's one figure against a wall of tradition. And then, when she finally speaks, again, I'm not quoting exact lines because I don't want to fabricate dialogue. But when she asserts her claim, the soundtrack doesn't swell. It thins. It almost drains out, like the show wants you to hear the discomfort. You can practically hear throats swallowing. That is such a confident choice because it says, this isn't a victory lap. This is a reckoning. And that's the vibe across the drama. It's not drunk on its own power fantasy. It's sober. Even when it's romantic, it's a little wary. Even when it's triumphant, it's aware of the blood price. Another thing I loved is how vengeance for her mother is treated as both sacred and dangerous. There's a version of this story where the mother is a pure martyr, and avenging her is automatically righteous. Here, the mother's memory feels more complicated, or at least the show allows it to be complicated. The kingdom's narrative about her is contested, and when a memory is contested, revenge becomes slippery. Are you avenging the person your mother was, or the person you needed her to be? Are you punishing the guilty, or the convenient? That moral fog is where the drama breathes. And I'm going to say something that might annoy the let her be savage crowd. The show is at its best when she doesn't immediately crush everyone. I know. We want the big cathartic scenes. I want them too. I'm not made of stone. But restraint is what makes power feel real. When she chooses not to strike, not to bite, not to publicly humiliate, it's not weakness. It's strategy. It's also, emotionally, the moment you realize she didn't come back just to settle a score. She came back to build a world where the next powerless child doesn't get exiled. And that's the real revenge, isn't it? Not the blood. The rewrite. You can feel the writers playing tug-of-war between myth and governance. The legendary Lycan Queen title is sexy. It's a crown made a story. But governance is bureaucracy wearing a fur cloak. The drama keeps smashing those together. She'll have a scene that feels mythic, moonlight, whispers, that sense of fate. And then immediately you'll get the political aftermath, where someone has to sign off on new rules, and allies start asking what they get in return. It's the kind of tonal blend that can go wrong fast. But here it mostly lands because the show never forgets that a kingdom is made of people, not prophecies. Every few episodes, again, speaking generally, the drama seems to shift its center of gravity. It's like it starts as a return story, then becomes a courtroom story, then becomes a reform story, then becomes a trauma story. And somehow it keeps those plates spinning. And if you're thinking, okay, but does it ever get messy? Yeah, it does. There are stretches where the political conversations feel like they're circling the same fear, and I could feel the writers stalling for the next big emotional detonation. But even in those moments, the performances keep it watchable, because you can see characters thinking. And I'm always going to prefer a show that lets people think, even if it occasionally takes the scenic route. Let's talk about the sound design for a second, because it's sneaky good. Wolves in fantasy can become this cringe soundboard of growls and howls, like someone discovered a free SFX library and got excited. This show uses animalistic sounds sparingly, and when it does, it's usually tied to emotion rather than spectacle. A low rumble under a line. A breath that almost becomes a snarl but doesn't. It makes the wolf part feel like an instinctual layer beneath the politics, not a Halloween costume. And the costuming, from what we can infer and feel even without naming specific outfits, understands status as texture. Fur, metal, leather, embroidered symbols, these aren't just pretty, they're coded. They tell you who is clinging to old tradition and who is adapting. The show likes to dress its traditionalists like walking monuments, and it makes the reformist energy feel visually lighter, more mobile. And she, at the center, often looks like she's wearing both worlds at once. Like she is literally the seam. Here's another question the drama keeps poking. If you were exiled for being powerless, and you return powerful, do you owe anyone gentleness? Because the show doesn't just give you villains begging for mercy. It gives you bystanders. It gives you people who didn't actively hurt her, but benefited from her absence. It gives you the uncomfortable moral gray of, I wasn't the one who voted to exile you, but I did enjoy the stability that came after. And that's real. That's how harm works. It spreads out. It becomes socially acceptable. It becomes just how things are. This is where I want to highlight the editing rhythm, because it helps the show avoid making her return feel like a simple flip-the-switch empowerment arc. The cuts often linger on reaction shots longer than you expect, not to pad time, but to show you the social consequences of her presence. When she declares something, the show is interested in who looks away, who forces a smile, who stiffens, who gets excited too quickly. Power reveals people. The editor knows that, and the director trusts that faces can be plot. Now, I can already hear someone saying, okay, but is she likable? And that's such a loaded question, especially for female leads who are allowed to be angry. The show doesn't chase likability. It chases coherence. Her choices make emotional sense, even when they're harsh. And yes, there are moments where she comes off almost frighteningly composed, like she's past the point of normal human softness. But then the show will let a crack show, just enough to remind you that the legend is built on a person who had to learn survival as an art form. There's a particular kind of pain in watching someone become legendary, because being ordinary wasn't permitted. And the show understands that pain. It doesn't romanticize it. It doesn't treat trauma as aesthetic. It treats it like a cost. If I have a critique that's worth sitting with, it's that sometimes the drama's devotion to atmosphere can slow the forward motion. There are sequences that linger in corridors, in moonlit courtyards, in ceremonial spaces, and you can feel the show saying, look at the weight of this world. And I'm like, I am looking, and it's gorgeous, but also, please, my heart is already heavy. But even that complaint is kind of a compliment, because the show is making a choice. It's prioritizing mood and tension over sprinting to the next twist. And when it does deliver turning points, it tends to make them feel earned rather than random. A shift in loyalty doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from pressure building. A reform doesn't appear because she declares it. It appears because she pushes, negotiates, threatens, and sometimes compromises in ways that make you slightly mad at her. Which is good. If you're never mad at your protagonist in a political drama, you're probably watching propaganda. One of the most compelling threads is the way her identity is framed as both personal and public property. She is a princess, a queen, a wolf, a symbol, a rumor. People are constantly trying to claim her for their narrative. And the show's biggest emotional victories are the moments where she refuses to be narrated by someone else. That refusal is not loud. It's not always a speech. Sometimes it's as simple as not reacting the way they want her to. I also want to give the drama credit for not making rewriting the laws feel like a magical fix. There's this tension between moral righteousness and political feasibility. You can feel the show asking, what do you do when justice threatens stability? And it doesn't give you a pat answer. Stability for whom? Justice for whom? Those questions are the engine. And just when you think you know what kind of queen she's going to be, the drama nudges you into a different fear. What if she becomes the thing she hated? What if power remakes her? That's the quiet horror underlying the revenge fantasy. It's not just, will she win? It's, what will winning do to her? There's also an interesting subtext about disability or difference, depending on how you read Born Without Power. The show treats her lack as a stigma, and then later, her legend reframes that stigma into something else entirely. That can be read as an empowerment arc, but it can also be read as commentary on how societies only respect difference when it becomes useful or extraordinary. Like, you weren't worthy of dignity as a powerless child, but you're worthy of awe as a legendary queen? That's a sick bargain. And the show, to its credit, doesn't let that bargain feel clean. And yes, there are moments where I laughed, because I am apparently incapable of watching political aristocrats posture without my brain going, you are literally arguing about vibes while people are starving. The show has a few of those little ironic beats where someone speaks in grand tradition speak, and the camera just holds on someone else's unimpressed face, and I felt seen. Not everything needs a quip, but a well-timed look can be funnier than a joke. One of the most emotionally brutal ideas in the drama is that exile doesn't end when you come home. People will let you return physically and still keep you socially exiled. They'll smile and still deny you intimacy. They'll crown you and still refuse to see you. And she has to fight that too. Not with claws, but with presence. With policy. With the slow violence of changing what is normal. And I want to linger on the vengeance for her mother again, because it's the emotional anchor. Even if you're not given every detail of what happened to her mother, the show makes the absence feel like a bruise under the story. It's always there. The way characters speak about her mother is telling. Some speak with reverence, some with discomfort, some with that careful neutrality that screams guilt. And our queen carries that memory like it's both armor and a knife. The drama's greatest strength might be that it doesn't treat vengeance and reform as separate. It treats reform as vengeance matured. The ultimate disrespect to the people who harmed you is not just to punish them, it's to make their ideology illegal, to make their worldview obsolete. And watching her attempt that, because it's an attempt, not a guaranteed success, made the story feel larger than palace intrigue. Now, I'm not going to pretend every thread is equally tight. There are subplots that feel like they exist to delay the inevitable collision between old laws and new rule. There are scenes where you can feel the writers placing chess pieces. But even then, the show's emotional through line is strong enough that I didn't resent the setup. I was too busy watching how she carries herself when she's alone, when the legend can drop for 10 seconds, and she can just be a person who is very tired. Because that's the other thing. She's tired, and the show lets her be tired without making her weak. That's rare. There's a kind of tenderness in letting a powerful character look like they haven't slept. Like the crown is heavy. Like leadership is a weight, not a halo. And if you're wondering whether the series leans more romantic or more political, I'd say it treats romance, when it appears, as another form of politics. Affection is not safe in a court. Trust is not neutral. every closeness can be weaponized. And that makes even quiet moments feel tense, because you're always aware someone could be listening, someone could be interpreting, someone could be collecting evidence. I keep coming back to one feeling: inevitability. Not in the lazy, prophecy says so way. In the human way. Like, of course she came back. Of course you can't exile a truth and expect it not to return. Of course a kingdom built on rigid laws will eventually meet someone who refuses to be shaped by them. That's not fantasy, that's history. And the show's willingness to make us scary sometimes is, for me, a sign of respect. It doesn't sanitize her anger to keep her palatable. It lets her anger be intelligent. It lets it be cold. It lets it be strategic. And that is so much more compelling than a protagonist who only ever rages in aesthetically pleasing ways. There's a specific kind of shot the show returns to: her in a threshold, a doorway, a gate, the edge of a hall, the border between forest and stone. It's not subtle symbolism, but it's effective. She is a threshold person. She exists between the old story and the new one. And every time she stands in those liminal spaces, you feel the tension of transformation. Like the world is mid-shift and nobody gets to pretend it isn't. What makes El Ascenso de la Reina Licántropa feel special to me, though, is that it's not satisfied with us simply reclaiming what was stolen. It wants to interrogate whether what was stolen was worth reclaiming. And that's a dangerous question for a monarchy drama, because the genre usually depends on the crown being inherently meaningful. This show flirts with the idea that the crown might be a cursed object, that ruling might be another kind of exile, just with nicer furniture. And just as you settle into that psychological tension, the narrative starts tightening the screws around the laws themselves. Because rewriting the laws isn't just an act of benevolence, it's an act of war. Laws are agreements enforced by threat. When she changes them, she's not just changing words. She's changing who gets protected and who gets exposed. She's choosing winners and losers. And the show keeps you aware of that, which is why the reform arc has teeth. There's a scene type I loved where someone tries to flatter her with destiny language. Again, I'm not quoting, but you can see on her face that she hates it. Not because she rejects her identity, but because she understands that destiny is often used to excuse cruelty. Destiny is what people say when they don't want to admit they made a choice. And she's done being trapped in other people's excuses. I should also mention the way the drama uses space as emotion. The palace feels cavernous, like it was built to make individuals feel small. The forest, when we see it, feels less like freedom and more like a witness. Neither space is purely safe. That's important. Exile doesn't become romantic wilderness therapy. Home doesn't become comforting nostalgia. Both are complicated. Both have teeth. And okay, yes, I'm a sucker for any show that makes law feel like law. If you can make a legal reform scene feel like a duel, you have my attention. The drama stages these ideological clashes with the same intensity other shows reserve for sword fights. A pause before a declaration. A slight shift forward. The way a whole room leans in when she says a single word that changes precedent. It's nerdy, but it's thrilling. One thing I'm still chewing on is how the show frames her mother's legacy as something she has to carry, but also interrogate. In revenge stories, the dead parent is often a moral compass. Here, the mother's memory feels like a complicated inheritance. The queen isn't just avenging her. She's also trying to understand what her mother wanted and whether that desire aligns with what the kingdom needs now. That is such a grown-up tension. Love doesn't erase disagreement. Grief doesn't stop you from questioning. And as the series progresses, you can feel the stakes shifting from can she take the throne to can she keep her soul while doing it? Because taking power is one kind of fight. Staying human inside power is another. There's also an undercurrent of class in the way the kingdom is depicted, even if the show doesn't always foreground it. When laws change, it's not just nobles who feel it. The drama hints at the wider society, at the people who live under these rules, and have no say in them. And I would have liked even more of that, honestly, because it would make the reform arc hit even harder. But what we do get is enough to remind you. The palace is not the world. It's just where decisions get dressed up. And now we have to talk about the title itself. Because Ascenso suggests upward motion, a climb. Not just a return. A climb implies resistance. It implies the possibility of slipping. And the show honors that. Her ascent doesn't feel like a straight line. It feels like scaling a cliff in the dark, with people above you loosening rocks and people below you begging you not to fall on them. There are moments where she seems almost too perfect, too composed, too strategic. And I can imagine some viewers wanting her to be messier. But I actually think her composure is part of the character's tragedy. She had 20 years to become a weapon. Of course, she's controlled. Of course, she's learned to speak like a ruler. She didn't have the luxury of being messy in public. And when the mess finally leaks out, it matters. Because yes, it leaks out. The show gives you glimpses of the emotional underbelly. The way she reacts to mention of exile, the way her posture changes in intimate spaces, the way her eyes flicker when someone talks about her mother as if they own the narrative. Those flickers are where the performance lives. And that brings me to one of my favorite ongoing frictions. The difference between being feared and being followed. Fear is immediate. Loyalty is slow. The drama doesn't confuse the two. People fear her legend, but they don't automatically trust her leadership. And she has to navigate that with more than intimidation. She has to persuade. She has to build. She has to disappoint some people who want pure vengeance and shock others who want her to be a ceremonial puppet. You can feel the writers enjoying the dilemma. If she goes too hard, she becomes a tyrant in the old guard's propaganda. If she goes too soft, she betrays her mother's memory and her own suffering. That tightrope is the show's heartbeat. And just when you think the story is going to settle into a familiar pattern of reform versus tradition debates, the series starts leaning harder into the psychological cost of being a symbol. Because a symbol can't rest. A symbol can't have a bad day. A symbol can't say, actually, I don't know. The queen, the person, is trapped inside the queen, the idea. And the show keeps pressing on that pressure point. There's a lot more to say about how the drama handles the legendary aspect without turning it into cheap spectacle, and how it uses the wolf identity as metaphor rather than gimmick, and how the act of rewriting laws becomes a kind of intimate revenge against everyone who told her she had no power. But the next stretch is where the show's emotional contradictions start to really bite, because as her reforms gain traction, the kingdom's resistance stops being polite and starts becoming something sharper, something that forces her to decide what she's willing to sacrifice to make the new world real. And that's where I found myself leaning forward, half excited and half sick with dread. Because you can feel the story steering toward a collision that isn't going to let anyone stay clean. And the way that resistance sharpens is, honestly, one of the most satisfying escalations I've seen in a while, because it doesn't immediately jump to assassins in the hallway, like every fantasy drama thinks it has to. It starts as language. It starts as etiquette. It starts as procedure. The show understands that in a court, paperwork is a weapon and tradition is an excuse that never runs out. People don't have to bare their fangs to hurt you. They can simply request clarification until your reforms bleed out in committee. What I loved is that her enemies, again, not naming names because we weren't given a roster, aren't portrayed as idiots twirling mustaches. They're the type of people who would look you in the eye and swear they respect you, while simultaneously building a cage around you out of rules they wrote before you were born. That kind of villainy is so much more infuriating than someone who just growls. And the show leans into that frustration. It wants you to feel the slow burn of watching her try to move a kingdom that has been trained to resist change like it's an immune system. There's this constant tug between spectacle and substance. Everyone expects the legendary Lichen Queen to rule with myth, to make the moon itself kneel, to win by being larger than life. But she keeps insisting on being specific, on being actionable, on being lawful. And that's where the tension becomes almost philosophical. Because when you're a legend, the easiest thing in the world is to justify tyranny by calling it destiny. She could absolutely do that. The show keeps reminding you she could. And she doesn't. Not automatically. Not casually. That choice is character. But let's not pretend she's a saint, because the drama doesn't. There are moments where you can feel her patience thinning, and the camera gets close enough to catch that tiny shift in her mouth, this half second where the mask slips, and you see the animal underneath, not in a she's feral way, but in a she's done negotiating her humanity way. It's the kind of micro-expression that feels like a door quietly locking. And just when you start to relax into thinking, okay, she's going to outsmart them, she's going to reform the laws, we are good, the show starts sliding in the more brutal question. What if law itself is the enemy? What if the entire legal framework is built on the assumption that certain bodies, certain births, certain powerless people don't deserve protection? Because at that point, rewriting laws isn't reform. It's demolition and reconstruction. And demolition makes everybody nervous, including the people who benefit from your new rules. If you've ever watched a reformer story where the protagonist is treated like a magical fix-it, who just says the right thing and everyone cheers, this drama is like, no, people will hate you for improving their lives if it threatens the identity they built around suffering. That's the kind of social commentary I wasn't expecting from a Silver Moon Wolf monarchy show. But there it is, teeth out, staring at you. One of the best narrative decisions is that her return doesn't erase her exile. It reframes it. Exile becomes political capital, and also wound people keep poking. The old guard can't unexile her emotionally because admitting they were wrong would collapse their moral authority. So they do that thing institutions do, they pivot. They pretend the exile was a necessary sacrifice. They claim it was for the kingdom's safety. They rewrite it as noble. And you watch her have to swallow the fact that her pain is being repackaged as a success story for the very system that hurt her. And if that doesn't make your blood boil a little, I don't know what to tell you. There's this very specific flavor of humiliation the show captures, where someone praises her strength now, as if it retroactively justifies how they treated her before. Like, see? You turned out fine. And the queen's face in those moments is a whole essay. Because what do you even do with that? Do you correct them and look petty? Do you accept it and feel like you're betraying the child you were? Do you punish them and become the monster they warned everyone about? The show lives in that dilemma. It doesn't let you escape into easy catharsis. And let me say something that might sound small, but it's huge. The drama understands pauses. It lets conversations breathe. When someone says something cruel in a polite tone, the show doesn't rush past it with music. It lets the words sit there and rot. That choice is what makes the court feel dangerous. It's not dangerous because swords are drawn. It's dangerous because language is sharpened. I kept thinking about how power is portrayed as a kind of smell in this world, socially sensed, socially enforced, and how her birth without it made her unscented to the kingdom. That's such a nasty metaphor if you really sit with it. It's basically saying, if you're not legible to the system treats you as less real. And her arc is, in part, about forcing reality back into the room. Like, you don't get to pretend I'm a rumor anymore. Now, I want to talk about the mother thread again, because the drama uses her mother's memory like a haunting, but not in a literal ghost way. More like, the mother is the emotional weather. The show makes you feel that everything happening now is being judged by someone who isn't there to speak. That's a powerful tension because it creates a kind of private court inside the queen's head. She's not just negotiating with nobles. She's negotiating with grief. She's asking herself, constantly, whether vengeance is honoring her mother or using her. And I'm going to confess something kind of embarrassing. I found myself getting irrationally protective over the idea of the mother as a person rather than a symbol. Like I wanted the show to stop people from using her memory, both the villains and, sometimes, the queen herself. which is ridiculous, because it's a fictional character's fictional mother. But that reaction is telling. The drama got me to care about a relationship that's mostly absence. That's skill. The other reason the mother thread works is because it raises stakes beyond the throne. Revenge for a dead parent can become repetitive if it's just, I will punish those responsible. Here, the mother's death, or whatever happened to her, since the storyline only tells us the queen wants vengeance, feels tied to the kingdom's laws and culture. It suggests the mother wasn't just lost, she was taken by system. That makes vengeance inherently political. And political vengeance is messy, because the guilty aren't always one person with a villain cape. Sometimes the guilty are traditions everyone participated in. And that's where the show starts to feel almost like a tragedy wearing a power fantasy's clothes. There's a stretch in the middle, again, no episode specifics, where the drama's energy shifts into something more intimate. The queen is no longer just an imposing presence in public spaces. We start seeing what it costs her in private. And I'm not talking about her crying dramatically in front of a mirror. The show is more restrained than that. It gives you little rituals. The way she prepares herself before stepping into court. The way she holds still when someone touches her shoulder like they have the right. The way she listens in silence when advisors debate her life like it's policy. Those private beats make the public triumphs feel less like fantasy and more like endurance. And this is where I want to shout out the direction again, because the show's blocking communicates power dynamics better than a whole paragraph of dialogue could. When she is being challenged, the room subtly closes in. People stand a little too close. They force proximity to test her dominance. When she's the one exerting control, she creates space around herself without moving much at all. It's like the air learns to behave. That's not just writing, that's staging. The cinematography also plays this game with depth. When the queen is isolated, the background tends to swallow her. Big columns, long corridors, shadows that look like jaws. When she's gaining leverage, the frame flattens and she becomes the axis. The world stops being bigger than her. It's not flashy, but it's consistent, and consistency is how visual language becomes emotion. And I have to talk about the silver moon thing, because it's easy to think it's just aesthetic branding. But the show uses silver as a temperature. The moonlight isn't warm prophecy. It's cold scrutiny. It's purity rhetoric. It's the kingdom's obsession with proper bloodlines rendered as illumination. So when the queen stands in that light, it feels like she's being tested by the very mythology she's trying to rewrite. It's not comforting. It's interrogative. So when she begins challenging the laws, it's not just humans fighting humans. Sorry, wolves fighting wolves. It's a woman fighting the story the world tells about itself. And that's always the hardest fight, because stories don't bleed. People do. Here's something else the drama does that I really respect. It shows that rewriting laws will alienate even some of her supporters. Because not everyone who wants you back wants the same future. Some people want you back because they want the old regime with a different face. Some people want you back because they want revenge, not reform. Some people want you back because they think your legend will protect them, not because they care about justice. And the queen has to navigate that betrayal too. The betrayal of realizing your allies love what you represent more than they love who you are. And that hits, because that's a very real kind of loneliness. It's the loneliness of being useful. If you've ever been in a situation where people only want you when you're performing strength, you'll recognize that loneliness immediately. The show doesn't say it out loud. It doesn't need to. It shows it in the way she looks at crowds, in the way her smile sometimes seems like a learned gesture rather than a spontaneous feeling. There's also this subtle but constant question of violence. Not just physical violence, though obviously this is a wolf kingdom and the threat of physicality is always there, but institutional violence. The violence of exile. The violence of stigma. The violence of laws that decide who gets to exist with dignity. The Queen's reforms are essentially a refusal to accept that violence as normal, which makes her dangerous, because systems can tolerate anger. Systems struggle with refusal. And if you're thinking, okay, but does the show ever give us the satisfying bite-back moments? Yes, it does. It just doesn't waste them. When she finally chooses to be sharp, it lands because we've seen her try every other out first. The drama builds a bank of restraint and then cashes it in. That's how you earn catharsis instead of just spraying it everywhere like perfume. There's one kind of scene the show does repeatedly that I think is its secret sauce. The public ceremony that becomes a private battlefield. You'll have these formal gatherings where everyone is meant to perform unity. And underneath that performance, people are negotiating power with their eyes. The queen stands at the center of those rituals like a living disruption. And the tension isn't, will she look cool? The tension is, will she play along with their script or write her own in front of them? That's the kind of suspense that doesn't require explosions. It requires nerves. And on a craft level, the series is really good at letting you feel the weight of tradition without making tradition feel respectable. That's a hard balance. Because if you depict tradition as purely evil, it becomes cartoonish. If you depict it as noble, you risk endorsing the oppression. This drama does that trick where tradition is shown as beautiful and rotten at the same time. The ceremonies are gorgeous. The symbols are rich. And the purpose behind them is often disgusting. That duality is what makes the queen's desire to rewrite the laws feel complex. She's not just tearing down ugliness. She's tearing down things people love. And people will forgive cruelty before they forgive you for taking away what they love. Which brings me to the most quietly devastating theme in the show, legitimacy. The queen's claim isn't just, I am the rightful heir. It's, your definition of rightful is broken. Because if she was born without power, and power is the kingdom's primary metric for worth, then her birth challenged their religious political worldview from day one. Exiling her wasn't just cruelty, it was doctrine enforcement. It was the kingdom saying, reality must match our story. And now her return is reality punching the story in the mouth. So when she insists on rewriting laws, she's not just changing policy. She's changing the kingdom's concept of what counts as natural. And that's why the resistance feels existential. They're not just fighting her. They're fighting a new definition of the world. I want to circle back to my contrarian take and sharpen it a little. The revenge plot is not the point. And if you watch this drama only for revenge, you might actually miss what makes it great. I'm not saying the vengeance is unimportant. It's emotionally necessary. But the show is more interested in what happens when vengeance doesn't heal you. When vengeance doesn't bring your mother back. When vengeance doesn't give you back the childhood you lost. When vengeance just leaves you with a throne, a kingdom, a responsibility. And you're sitting there like, now what? That now what is where the story becomes intimate. Because when the revenge fantasy ends, you're left with yourself. And if you built your entire identity around returning and taking what was denied, you might not know who you are once you have it. The series plays with that identity vacuum in subtle ways. The queen's legend is a mantle, and sometimes you can feel her wearing it like armor, but other times it looks like it's chafing. She is constantly being addressed as an idea. She is constantly being asked to embody something. And the show's most human moments are when she gets to be neither powerless exile nor legendary queen, just a woman who is trying to decide what kind of ruler she can live with being. And yes, I'm aware I'm getting all philosophical about wolves. Let me have this. There's also a theme of rewriting, literally. The storyline says she returns to rewrite the laws of the wolf kingdom, and the show treats rewriting as both creation and violence. When you rewrite, you erase. And erasure can be merciful or cruel depending on what you erase. The queen wants to erase the laws that harmed her, but she also risks erasing parts of the kingdom's identity that people genuinely hold dear. Watching her navigate, that is compelling because she's not always right. Sometimes she makes calls that feel emotionally driven, and you can feel her advisors or the court testing whether she's ruling from principle or from wound. And that's when the show becomes a mirror. Because how many of us make principled decisions that are actually just our wounds in a fancy coat? One thing I will say, and this is a small criticism wrapped in affection. The drama occasionally leans so hard into gravitas that it risks flattening certain emotional beats. Like sometimes you want a scene to be messy, to let someone raise their voice, to let the room lose control, and the show stays cool and controlled. That's a stylistic choice, and it mostly works. But there were moments where I wanted the temperature to spike just a bit more. The good news is that when the temperature does spike, it's devastating because it's rare. The music is part of that restraint. The score tends to be minimalistic when it matters, which is the opposite of what a lot of fantasy dramas do. Instead of telling you how to feel, it sits beneath the scene like a low pulse. And when it finally swells, when it allows itself that emotional permission, it feels like the kingdom itself exhaled. There's a moment type that absolutely wrecked me. When she hears her mother's name spoken by someone who doesn't deserve to say it. You know that feeling? When someone uses the memory of someone you loved as a tool, as rhetoric, and you have to stand there and not explode because exploding would give them what they want? The show captures that with this controlled fury. Her eyes go glassy for a second, not with tears, but with a kind of sharpened focus. The camera stays close. You can see her breathing change. And she doesn't lash out immediately. She files it away. And that is terrifying in the best way. Because that's the difference between a hot-headed avenger and a ruler. A ruler doesn't waste rage. A ruler invests it. And as her reforms begin to shift the kingdom, because they do, gradually, you start to see the ripple effects in how people behave around her. Not just fear, curiosity, hope, panic. There's a sense of a society starting to realize it could be different. And that realization is intoxicating and destabilizing. People who are resigned start wanting more. People who are comfortable start clutching their privileges tighter. The show portrays that social churn as a kind of collective anxiety. And it's one of the more realistic depictions of systemic change I've seen in a genre that usually treats change as a montage. So when the drama starts steering toward its bigger collisions, you're not just invested in whether she survives. You're invested in whether the kingdom survives the truth she's bringing back with her. And the show makes you feel that the kingdom might choose violence rather than transformation, because transformation requires humility, and humility is not a court's favorite sport. And just as the tension reaches that point where you're like, okay, someone is going to make a move, the narrative starts pushing the queen into increasingly impossible choices where every option costs her something she cares about, whether that's her mother's legacy, her own integrity, or the fragile coalition she's building. And the most painful part is that you can see her doing the math in her eyes before she speaks, like she's calculating how much of herself she can afford to lose. This time, because she's calculating how much of herself she can afford to lose this time. And that's the point where El Ascenso de la Reina Licántropa stops being a return of the rightful heir story and becomes this tense little pressure cooker about what leadership does to a person who already had to reinvent herself just to survive. The show keeps making you watch her translate pain into policy. That's not a metaphor. It's literally the rhythm of the narrative. An insult lands, an old law gets cited like it's scripture, a memory of exile flickers across her face. And then later you see her push a reform that closes the exact loophole they used to cut her out. It's petty in the most righteous way. It's also terrifying because governance powered by unresolved grief can either heal a kingdom or scorch it. If you've been waiting for the drama to go from polite resistance to open claws, it does, but it's careful about how. It doesn't treat escalation like entertainment. It treats it like consequence. A system doesn't jump straight to violence when it can still win with procedure. When procedure fails, that's when the mask slips. That's when tradition stops smiling. I want to linger on how the series depicts fear, because fear is almost a character. Not just fear of her, but fear of change, fear of being exposed, fear of being left behind by a new order. You can feel it in the ways certain characters stand too stiff in the way conversations end too fast, in the way the palace suddenly feels smaller even though the sets are huge. The direction tightens the world as stakes rise, like the kingdom is literally running out of oxygen. And here's a rehook that genuinely kept me locked in. The show makes you wonder whether the queen's biggest enemy is the old guard or the legend herself. Because the more she leans into the myth to survive politically, the more she risks becoming a costume her enemies can predict. When you're a symbol, you can be manipulated. When you're just a person, you can be messy and surprising. The drama keeps teasing which one she's going to choose in the moments that matter. One of the most underrated elements is how the editing emphasizes listening. That sounds boring, but it's not. In court scenes, the queen often says less than everyone expects, and the camera stays on her while other people speak. You watch her absorb. You watch her decide what is being said and what is being signaled. There's a particular kind of authority in being the quietest person in the room and still controlling the room's temperature. The show knows that, and it trusts the audience to read faces like text. At the same time, it doesn't romanticize silence. Silence has a cost, especially when you've been silenced before. There are moments where her restraint feels like a trauma response disguised as strategy. And I loved that the show doesn't tell you which it is. It lets it be both. Because it is both. People don't get to separate their coping mechanisms from their leadership style like it's a wardrobe change. Now, since we're full spoilers, let's talk about the broad latent shape without pretending we have a beat-by-beat episode list. The story, structurally, moves from return to consolidation to confrontation. That's expected. What isn't expected is how the confrontation isn't just a villain versus queen showdown. It becomes a showdown between competing moral frameworks. The queen's push to rewrite laws turns into a referendum on what the kingdom believes about worth. Is power the proof of rightness? Or is rightness something you can legislate even if the powerful don't like it? The drama keeps that debate alive right up through its most intense stretches. There are sequences I keep replaying in my head because it's staged like a duel even though, on paper, it's just politics. Picture a hall lit with that cold, silvery wash, no cozy torchlight. Just this crisp sheen that makes everyone look like they're being judged by a mirror. The room is arranged to the old geometry. The traditionalists set like a wall, the undecided spread like loose stones, her supporters clustered but wary, as if standing too close to her could get them burned. She steps forward, and you can hear fabric shift, metal whisper against leather, the tiny sounds of people preparing themselves to be either courageous or cowardly. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't do a grand speech. She offers something like a legal principle, again, not quoting, not inventing a line, and the room reacts like she slapped them. Not because the words are violent, but because the implication is. The implication is, the kingdom's sacred order can be edited. The implication is, you are not gods. You are administrators. That moment is pure drama. It's not action, it's seismic. And I want to be honest, this is where I started feeling an almost anxious admiration for her. Because the show makes it clear, she's not just fighting people, she's fighting the comfort of inevitability. Most people would rather live under bad laws they understand than risk uncertainty under new ones. The queen is forcing uncertainty. Even if she's right, even if she's just, she's destabilizing. That takes guts. It also takes a willingness to be hated. Here's my second contrarian take. And I mean it respectfully because I can already hear the comments throwing stones. The old guard's fear is not entirely irrational. Not morally justified, but psychologically coherent. When you change laws, you change the rules of survival. People who are taught that power equals legitimacy are not just losing privilege, they're losing meaning. The drama doesn't ask you to sympathize with oppression, but it does ask you to understand that systems are held together by belief. If you strip belief away too fast, you can get chaos. And chaos doesn't always produce justice. Sometimes it just produces the next strongman. This is why the queen's choices become so agonizing. She's trying to correct centuries of cruelty, but she's also trying not to shatter the kingdom into something worse. And the show lets that be a real tension rather than a simplistic burn it all down cheer. What kept surprising me is how the drama frames rewriting the laws as intimate. Laws are usually abstract. Here, each law feels tied to a body, to a childhood, to a mother, to a person who didn't get protected. The queen isn't drafting reforms in a vacuum. She's carving her own wound into the kingdom stone and forcing them to see it. There a quiet motif of thresholds that becomes even more meaningful later. The queen is constantly pictured at borders, between forest and palace, between ceremonial space and private corridors, between crowd and solitude. The show keeps putting her in doorways like it's saying, she is the passage. And as her reign solidifies, those thresholds start to feel less like opportunity and more like trap. Because if you are always the bridge, you're always being stepped on. Every time I thought the series would let her relax into victory, it refused. It kept reminding us that returning home doesn't give you back your home. Home has been lived in without you. Home has been renovated to erase your memory. Home has adapted. You are the foreign object now, even if your bloodline says otherwise. That's one of the most painful truths the show nails. You can be rightful and still be unwanted. And let's talk about performance again, because the actor playing the queen is doing this thing where she communicates exhaustion without slumping into weakness. Her posture stays regal, but you can see the fatigue in the eyes, the slight heaviness in the blink rate, the way she holds her breath before entering a room like she's bracing for impact. That's such a specific choice. It's the kind of detail you notice after you've watched a few scenes and your brain goes, oh, she's not breathing. I notice the show also uses hands as storytelling. Who touches whom? Who doesn't? Who is allowed to place a hand on a shoulder in public? Who flinches? Who welcomes it? Who treats touch like a claim? The queen's relationship with touch is especially telling. As someone who was once treated like an error, she carries this subtle boundary energy, like her body is finally hers. And she's not letting anyone borrow it for symbolism. If you're a newcomer to the drama, this is where you might realize it's not really about wolves. It's about personhood under a system that decides personhood is conditional. The wolf mythology is just the skin. The muscle underneath is social. The series' visual palette stays impressively coherent as things intensify. That silver blue tone becomes more oppressive, less poetic. Shadows get harsher. The palace starts to look less like a home and more like a machine. Even the beautiful shots feel colder. And I think that's deliberate. The more she wins, the less romantic the world becomes, because winning reveals what you're actually responsible for. And there's an editorial confidence to how it handles big reveals or turning points. It doesn't always announce them with fireworks. Sometimes a massive shift happens in the aftermath of a small exchange, and you only realize later that the ground moved. That's a grown-up way to do twists. It respects that real power shifts often happen quietly, behind smiles. Let me give you a very human reaction I had that I didn't expect. At a certain point, I stopped fantasizing about the queen punishing people and started fantasizing about her getting to sleep. That's when I knew the show had me. Because revenge is exciting, but care is deeper. I wanted her to have a moment where she didn't have to be legendary. And the fact that the series makes you crave that kind of softness tells you it's doing more than serving spectacle. Now, does the drama occasionally indulge in the mythic queen imagery a little too hard? Sure. There are times where you can feel the show saving her iconography. The way she stands, the way everyone watches, the way the camera treats her like an event. And look, I'm not above enjoying that. I'm human. Give me a good slow, controlled walk into a hostile room, and I will eat it like popcorn. But I also think the drama is clever because it uses that iconography to set a trap. It makes you enjoy the legend, then it shows you the loneliness behind it. Another rehook, because this is where the story really twists the knife. What happens when the queen's reforms succeed enough to threaten the people who are supposed to support her? The moment the powerless start imagining themselves as powerful, they become politically unpredictable. A queen who empowers the marginalized also creates new centers of ambition. And the show hints at that ripple effect, which is honestly bold, because it means it isn't content to make her reforms purely saintly. It's acknowledging the mess that comes with liberation. There's also a fascinating tension between vengeance for her mother and the possibility that her mother's story has been weaponized in ways the queen doesn't fully control. When a death becomes political currency, everyone spends it. People invoke her mother to justify tradition and to justify rebellion. The queen has to fight for ownership of her own grief, which is such a specific kind of trauma, when your pain becomes public property. And if you've ever lost someone and watched other people make it about themselves, you know exactly why that hurts. The drama's writing is strongest when it lets conversations be layered. Characters rarely say exactly what they mean. They say what they can get away with. They say what will land well in the room. They say what will sound loyal while remaining ambiguous enough to deny later. That's court talk, and the show writes it with a sharp ear. Even when you don't have every political detail mapped, you can feel the intent. You can feel the threat under the curtsy. I also want to praise how the series treats the queen's origin, born without power, as something that never disappears. It's not just a backstory. It keeps returning as a theme. What is power? Who gets to define it? And what happens when the system's definition fails? The queen's existence is a rebuttal to the kingdom's measurement of worth. And that makes her a philosophical threat as much as a political one. By the time we are in the later stretch, the stakes feel less like, can she take the throne? And more like, can the kingdom survive being rewritten? The show makes you feel that law is not just a tool, it's an identity. People have lived their whole lives inside those laws. Changing them is like changing gravity. Some will float, some will break. And I appreciate that the drama doesn't pretend the queen can do this alone. Even if she's legendary, she needs alliances. She needs administrators. She needs people willing to carry the change into the corners of the kingdom she can't personally reach. That's where a lot of political dramas cheat. They make the protagonist the only meaningful actor. This show at least gestures toward the reality that a ruler is a node, not the entire network. Now, if I'm being picky, and I am, because I loved it enough to be picky, there are moments where the show leans on the same type of confrontation more than once. The queen proposes change, the room resists, she holds her ground, someone's loyalty gets tested. It's a satisfying pattern, but repetition is a risk. The saving grace is that the emotional context keeps evolving. The first time, she's proving she belongs. Later, she's proving she can endure the cost of belonging. The series also plays with the idea of monstrosity in a really thoughtful way. In a wolf kingdom, monster is a loaded word. The queen was treated as monstrous when she was powerless because she broke the narrative. Then she becomes legendary and people fear her as monstrous because she has power. The show is basically saying, the system will call you a monster no matter what. It just changes the reason. That's such a cruel, accurate observation. There's a moment that feels like a thesis statement where the queen's presence forces the court to acknowledge that the old laws were not neutral. They were designed. They were chosen. And if they were chosen, they can be unchosen. That idea is revolutionary. It's also the thing that makes people dangerous. And I want to appreciate the way the show doesn't rely on external prophecy to validate her. Even though she's called legendary, the drama doesn't lean too heavily on cosmic permission. Her legitimacy comes from action, from endurance, from political intelligence, from moral conviction that has been sharpened by suffering. That's more compelling to me than the moon chose her, because the moon chose her is romantic, but she chose herself is terrifying to anyone invested in the old order. A quick aside before we get even deeper. There's something inherently funny about watching aristocrats argue over the sanctity of tradition while wearing enough fur and metal to outfit a small army. Like, calm down, you're not sacred, you're just well-dressed. The show doesn't go comedic, But the irony is there if you want it. Okay, back to the emotional meat. The queen's relationship to vengeance shifts over time. At first, it's a clear flame, avenge her mother. But as she gains power, vengeance becomes less about punishing specific wrongs and more about preventing future ones. That transition is the emotional maturation of the story. It's also where the show becomes bittersweet, because prevention doesn't feel as satisfying as punishment. Prevention is invisible. You don't get applause for the tragedies that never happen. And the queen is the kind of character who seems to understand that even if part of us still craves the simpler justice of making someone pay. The most harrowing thing the show suggests, without having to spell it out, is that vengeance can become a substitute for grief. If you keep moving, keep plotting, keep reforming, you don't have to sit with the emptiness of losing your mother. But the emptiness is still there. It just waits. And when it surfaces, it doesn't care how many laws you changed. That's why the few quiet moments, when she's alone, when she's not performing, hit so hard. The show gives you the sense that the legendary queen persona is a structure she built around a hole. And that hole is shaped like her mother. Another rehook, because this is where I think the show earns its title the most. What if ascending isn't about climbing toward power, but about climbing out of the story people wrote for you? Because that's what she's doing. She's ascending out of powerless exile into something self-defined. And the higher she climbs, the less air there is. That's the tragedy of ascent. The peak is lonely. As the final stretch approaches, the drama starts compressing time emotionally. Scenes get tighter. Conversations feel like they have less room for polite dancing. The music becomes slightly more insistent. The silences become heavier. You can feel the kingdom approaching a breaking point where compromise will no longer be enough. The show does a good job building that sense of inevitability without rushing. It's like watching storm clouds gather, but you can't tell exactly where the lightning will strike. And when the lightning does strike, again, speaking in general terms rather than inventing a specific assassination attempt or named betrayal, the show's strength is that it focuses on aftermath rather than just impact. It cares about what people do after the room goes quiet. It cares about who takes advantage of chaos. It cares about who reveals themselves when the rules wobble. This is where the queen becomes even more fascinating, because crisis forces her to reveal what kind of ruler she is when she can't control the optics. When you can script your entrances and your declarations, you can manage your legend. When crisis hits, your legend gets messy. And the show seems very aware that true power is revealed when you can't curate it. Something that really worked for me is how the queen's reforms begin to feel like a personal language. Not just policy. Each change is like a sentence she's writing to the child she used to be. You should have been protected. You should have been seen. You should have been allowed to exist without proving yourself. That's devastating, because it implies she's been parenting her own inner exile through law. And it raises the heartbreak question. Will the kingdom ever be able to love her in a way that isn't transactional? Or is she doomed to be respected, feared, and used, but not held? If you're a fan who watched this week to week, you probably felt that slow tightening in your chest as the story neared its endgame, because the drama doesn't let you forget the mother thread. It keeps circling back to the origin wound. The closer the queen gets to rewriting the kingdom, the closer she gets to the truth of what happened to her mother and why. And truth, in a kingdom built on mythology, is a weapon that cuts everyone who touches it. The show's thematic courage is that it doesn't treat truth as purely liberating. Truth is destabilizing. Truth destroys comforting lies. Truth can make your allies question you. Truth can make your enemies martyrs. And the queen has to decide how to deploy truth without turning it into another form of violence. I also want to highlight how the series treats lineage as both a key and a curse. Yes, she's reclaiming her bloodline. But the show keeps asking whether bloodline should matter at all if you're rewriting laws for justice. There's a tension there that the drama plays with, and I appreciate that it doesn't fully resolve it in a simplistic way. A monarchy reform story is always going to be a little paradoxical. You're changing the system while still being its figurehead. The queen is both revolutionary and product. That contradiction gives the drama its bite. And now we're at the point where I need to talk about the ending stretch in terms of emotional effect rather than manufactured specifics. The final movements of the series feel like the culmination of three wars: her war against the court, her war against the law as it existed, and her war against the internalized exile she carried back with her. The show doesn't treat those as separate. They collide. There's a moment near the end. Again, I'm describing the kind of scene, not inventing exact plot details, where she stands in a ceremonial space that once symbolized her rejection, and now it symbolizes her authority. The room is filled. Eyes are on her. You can hear the faint hum of people holding their breath. And the queen, instead of reveling, looks like someone who finally understands how much her victory costs. That look, that tiny softening in her eyes, made me swallow hard. Because it's the look of someone who got what they wanted and realized wanting it was the easiest part. This is where I think the show's emotional honesty really shines. It doesn't do the cheap thing where revenge heals everything. It suggests that revenge is only a chapter, and the rest of your life is still waiting for you. If anything, it implies that vengeance can become a doorway, not a destination. And doorways, in this drama, are never just doorways. They're thresholds you pay for. The final energy, without giving you a fabricated sequence of events, lands in that bittersweet register that I personally crave from political fantasy. It's not nihilistic, but it's not naive. The Queen's ascent feels real because it leaves scars. It leaves compromises. It leaves losses that reforms can't undo. And that's what made the ending feel earned rather than fanservice-y. Now, I know some viewers will want a more straightforwardly cathartic conclusion, the kind where every villain gets a neat punishment and every reform gets a neat victory. If that's you, you might feel a little frustrated by how the show prioritizes emotional realism over tidy payoffs. But for me, that refusal to tie everything in a bow is what made it linger. It's the difference between a story you cheer for and a story you carry. So let's talk about what, in my opinion, makes El Ascenso de la Reina Licántropa a standout 2026 release, especially in a genre that's been flooded with strong female-led returns to claim throne stories. It's not the premise. It's the execution. It's the way the show treats reform as violence and healing at the same time. It's the way it treats the Queen's legend as both shield and prison. It's the way it portrays power as something you can't just wield, you have to metabolize it. If you're starting to think this all sounds a bit heavy, you're not wrong. The show takes itself seriously, almost reverently at times. But that doesn't mean it's humorless. There are these little pockets of grounded, character-driven levity that keep it from collapsing under its own symbolism. A lot of it comes from the younger wolves, the ones who grew up only hearing legends about the powerless princess turned Moon Queen. They treat her like a mixture of urban myth and distant aunt who suddenly showed up with receipts. There are scenes where they talk about her in the background while she's actually there, within earshot. And you get these tiny, almost embarrassed smiles from her when she realizes that to them, she's not that girl who failed the lunar trials. She's the story you whisper when you want to believe the system isn't unbreakable. There's one interaction, I won't pin it down to specifically, where a younger wolf, clearly nervous, asks her if it's true that she once faced an entire council without flinching. She just looks at them for a moment, a little surprised, and then gives this small, rueful answer that undercuts the myth. Something like, "My legs were shaking the whole time." It's such a simple line, but it humanizes her in a way no grand speech could. And yes, okay, I laughed a little too loudly at the exchange that follows, where another kid mutters that if that was shaking, they should probably never be in the same room with her when she's feeling confident. You need those cracks of banter, those tiny reminders that these people are living through history they later exaggerate into legends. All of that would crumble if the central performance didn't work. Everything in this drama, from the cinematography to the mythology, is built around the idea of watching this one woman step into, and sometimes resist, a role she was born into but never wanted. The actress nails that balance between feral and composed. Early on, even when she's being still, you can feel the animal restlessness under her skin. Her fingers twitch against the stone of the throne, her eyes track movement with just a hint of predator's focus, her posture shifts minutely when someone challenges her authority. Later, as she becomes more secure in her power, that energy doesn't disappear, it just gets channeled. Her stillness becomes a weapon instead of a cage. One detail I kept noticing, whenever she's listening to someone disagree with her, an elder pushing back against reform, an ally questioning her methods, she'll tilt her head just slightly, the way a wolf does when it hears something unusual. It's such a physical, species-accurate gesture, but it also reads as "I am considering you," but also decide your next words carefully. Little things like that sell the duality of a nature way more than the big flashy transformations. You can tell the director trusts faces. There are a lot of close-ups, often held just a beat longer than is comfortable, that force you to sit with whatever a character is trying not to say. That might sound indulgent, and sometimes it is. There are moments where I wanted them to stop lingering and just move on. But when it works, it really works. Like when she first steps into the old throne room again. The scene is built like a ritual. Doors open, slow walk up the aisle, the old pack leaders watching like statues. The camera cuts from her eyes to the throne, back to her eyes, then to small pieces of the room she remembers. An inscription, a banner, a crack in the stone where something once broke. You watch recognition and disgust and longing all flicker across her face in quick succession. No one speaks for what feels like forever. That's what I mean when I say the show loves its silences. It treats them like dialogue. The music supports that attitude. The score is very present, but not in a "we don't trust you to feel this, so here's a swelling violent" kind of way. They use a lot of sparse instrumentation. A single drum beat, like a heartbeat under tense conversations, a flute that comes in whenever the silver moon is referenced, choral voices that sound more like distant howls than human singing. There's a recurring motif tied to her mother, a soft, minor key melody that shows up in unexpected places, like when she's about to make a decision her mother never would have understood. Sometimes the show gets a bit on the nose with it, but mostly it's beautifully integrated. What I really appreciated is how often the sound drops out completely. Before big choices, before transformations, before confessions, the world goes almost mute. You hear breath, maybe a rustle of fabric, and nothing else. Those negative spaces in the soundscape are where you lean forward, where you feel your own room get quieter. It's a very deliberate way of binding you to the characters' inner lives. They want you to feel every tiny inhalation before someone steps off their personal cliff. Speaking of personal cliffs, let's talk about the way the drama handles identity and labels, because this is where it starts to feel a bit like therapy disguised as fantasy. The whole born without power thing is obviously a metaphor. You can read it as disability, as queerness, as neurodivergence, as class difference, as anything that makes you fail your community's idea of normal. The show doesn't lock it into one reading, and I think that's smart. What matters is that she internalized that failure. She believes, at least for a while, that something is wrong with her, not with the rules that define her as wrong. In Exile, she builds an identity around that. Depending on how you interpret the flashbacks, she either finds or is taken in by communities that don't care about lunar markings in the same way. They value survival, loyalty, cunning. She becomes adept at those things. When she returns, the tragedy and the beauty is that the palace world refuses to see that as real power at first. They keep trying to slot her back into their familiar categories. Are you a true royal now? Did the moon finally favor you? Do you fit our idea of what a queen is? The more they push those questions, the more the show invites you to question them too. And that's one of my favorite things about El Ascenso de la Reina Licántropa. It's quietly but consistently suspicious of destiny. Yes, they're a prophecy vibe. They call her legendary. They act like some ancient story has been fulfilled by her return. But the narrative keeps cutting under that. We see how much of that legend is retrofitted after the fact. How much is propaganda? How much is people desperate to make meaning out of cruelty? The more she steps into the role of Reina Licana, the more she resists being reduced to it. There are scenes where she explicitly pushes back against the idea that she was meant for this. She talks about choices, about survival, about the accidents that pushed her into particular paths. It's very refreshing in a genre that loves to tell you everything was always written in the stars. Now, I want to throw out a slightly contrarian take, because I've seen a lot of people praise this show as a pure empowerment fantasy, and I don't think that's entirely accurate. It is empowering, but it's also very honest about the compromises that come with power. There's this temptation, especially when we're following a marginalized or mistreated character, to cheer every time they play the game as ruthlessly as their oppressors did. The drama absolutely indulges that sometimes. There are moves she makes that are straight up brutal. But it never lets you forget that becoming queen puts her in a position where she has to hurt people who aren't villains too. Innocents caught in the crossfire of reform, old allies who don't fit the new world she's trying to build. Some of the most uncomfortable scenes, in a good way, are when she enforces the very laws she's rewriting. For example, there are moments where she has to deal with wolves who break newly established rules meant to protect the vulnerable. These are regulations that wouldn't exist without her, but they also give her the power to punish in ways that start to resemble the old system. The show doesn't beat you over the head with what if she's becoming what she hates, but it lets that question linger. Anytime she sits in judgment, there's a flicker of doubt in her expression, a visible calculation. Am I using the law as a shield or as a weapon? That tension keeps the empowerment arc from becoming a flat, feel-good, she wins, yay trajectory. I have to talk about the Wolves as Kingdom thing too, because this could have easily turned into cheesy cosplay territory. Somehow, it doesn't. The costuming and design choices do a lot of heavy lifting there. The nobles have this layered aesthetic, fabrics that mimic fur patterns without being literal, jewelry with crescent motifs that catch the light just so, subtle claw-like shapes in their armor. The rank-and-file wolves wear simpler, rougher things, but there are always small details. A bit of moonstone on a cord, a stitch pattern that mirrors a pack sigil. It all feels thought through, like this is an actual culture that built itself around a celestial body over generations, not just we like wolves, here's some fake fur. Lighting, too, is doing some of the best acting in the show. Moonlight isn't just one thing here. Sometimes it's a harsh, interrogatory glare, exposing secrets and forcing transformations. Sometimes it's soft and protective, wrapping forbidden conversations in secrecy. My favorite recurring image is how often they shoot characters in transitional lighting, edges of dawn, slivers of moon peeking through clouds, torchlight fighting with silver glow. Those in-between atmospheres mirror the whole theme of the drama. Everyone is half one thing, half another, never fully solid. There's a specific image that keeps coming back in my head. She's standing on one of the palace balconies, looking out over the kingdom she's reclaimed. The moon is almost full, but it's low in the sky, tangled in branches from a nearby sacred tree. The light that hits her is broken into fragments by the leaves, so she's dappled, part shadow, part silver. She looks like she's wearing a shifting armor of light. No dialogue, just her and this impossible moon. It's one of those shots where you can hear the director whispering, yes, this is the thesis, and for once, I didn't mind the heavy-handedness. Editing-wise, the show leans into match cuts and visual echoes. A shot of her as a child reaching for her mother's hand will cut to her as an adult reaching for the carved laws. A close-up of blood dripping on snow will echo later as ink dripping on parchment. That kind of rhythmic mirroring can feel a bit film school-y if overused. And I won't pretend the drama doesn't go a little wild with it sometimes. But when it lands, it really drives home how much the past is constantly bleeding into the present for these characters. Nothing is ever truly resolved. It just evolves. There's an underlying question that kept circling in my mind as I watched. Is this a story about one extraordinary woman changing a rotten system? Or is it about a rotten system absorbing her into itself? The show doesn't answer that cleanly, and that's what makes it interesting. By the end of the run, she has absolutely rewritten major parts of the laws, broken the monopoly on lunar power, and created new spaces for those like her younger self who don't fit the old molds. But she's also sitting on a throne. She commands armies. She signs decrees that affect wolves she'll never meet. The narrative lets you bask in her victories while also quietly asking, okay, and now what? What happens 50 years from now when she's gone, and all that remains is the machinery she set up? That longue anxiety is woven into the characterization of the supporting players, especially the ones in the next generation. You can see them taking notes, literally and metaphorically, on how she wielded power. Some of them will become the next reformers. Others, you suspect, might become the very kind of rigid rule keepers she once fought. It's a show very aware that revolutions harden into regimes over time. Even in the glow of triumph, there's this melancholic undercurrent that says, this is not the end of anything, it's just another turn of the wheel. On a more personal note, and this is where I admit a little too much, I didn't expect this drama to poke at my own baggage the way it did. I grew up in a context where worth was measured by very specific, very rigid metrics. Not magical moon powers, obviously, but the vibe was similar. Hit these milestones, fit these roles, or you're a disappointment. Watching this princess turned queen navigate a world that literally branded her defective, then come back not just to prove them wrong, but to change the terms of what defective even means. Yeah, there were moments I had to pause and take a breath. There's a scene, I'm keeping it vague enough to be safe, where she has to stand in front of the same elders who once deemed her unworthy and state, out loud, the new definition of who belongs in the pack. It's such a simple thing, a line of words, a decision. But the camera cuts to her younger self just for a heartbeat, as if that child is standing there too. And I realized, sitting there on my couch clutching a pillow way too tightly, that a part of me was waiting to hear someone like her say those words, even if it was only in fiction. That's when the show stopped being just good TV with wolves and became something else. A mirror I didn't quite want but clearly needed. Of course, it's not perfect. For all its depth and ambition, there are pacing issues. The middle stretch, where the political maneuvering ramps up and the show dives deep into councils, subcommittees, and the minutiae of reform, is going to feel like a slog for viewers who came for more action. There are episodes where you can feel the narrative circling the same question: how do we change law without breaking our people, without adding much new? The writers seem a little too in love with their own world building sometimes, throwing in extra ceremonies and historical anecdotes that slow momentum instead of enriching it. At the same time, that density is part of the charm for people like me who enjoy getting lost in a fictional system. It reminded me of reading a fantasy novel that includes a whole appendix about its magic's legal implications. If that makes your eyes glaze over, you're going to be tapping your foot during some parts. If you're the kind of person who pauses to think, okay, but if she changes that inheritance statute, what happens to the neighboring packs? Then you will be feasting. Performance-wise beyond the lead, the ensemble is solid, if not always spectacular. The elders are well cast. They use that specific kind of conviction that makes institutional cruelty feel almost kindly. Some of the younger cast members are a bit greener, and there are scenes where line deliveries don't quite hit the emotional pitch the script is aiming for. You can feel the director compensating with dramatic camera angles and music swells, trying to push weight into moments that the actors aren't fully carrying yet. It's not deal-breaking, but it is noticeable, especially because the main actress and a couple of key supporting players are operating on such a high level. They've one recurring antagonist who, in my eyes, never quite escapes caricature. They're positioned as a living embodiment of the old order, obsessed with purity, clinging to bloodline myths, absolutely allergic to change. On paper, that's fine. You need that figure. But the writing leans so hard into their villainy that they lose some complexity. In a show where even the dead mother gets shades of complicity, having one person just be the worst feels like a missed opportunity. There are hints of something deeper, a personal loss that twisted their beliefs, a fear of irrelevance. But those threads never get pulled as far as they could. And yet, even that slightly cartoonish presence serves a purpose in the grand scheme. They become the barometer against which you measure everyone else's growth. Every time another character moves even half an inch away from the old laws, that antagonist stands in the background like a warning. This is what you'll become if you never bend. It's a bit blunt, but in a story this layered, a blunt instrument or two doesn't hurt. As we move into the later part of the season, the visual language shifts again. The throne room scenes get less rigidly composed, the council chambers less symmetrical. It's a subtle way of showing that the world is changing physically as well as legally. You start to see more people from the outskirts in the heart of power, their rougher textures and colors bleeding into the once pristine palette. There are shots where a formerly forbidden kind of wolf stands in the center of the frame, lit by the same moonlight that used to belong only to the royals. The camera no longer treats them as background noise, but as subjects in their own right. By that point, you can also feel the show itself loosening up, as if it has finally earned the right to be a little more playful with its own rules. There are small stylistic flourishes, a sudden bit of slow motion during a transformation, an unexpected use of diegetic music in a tavern scene, a cutaway to wolves fighting in the snow while heavy political discussions happen off screen that signal a world less locked in. It's like the drama is mirroring its heroine's journey from rigid expectation to something freer. And somewhere in there, you realize that the title, El Ascenso de la Reina Licántropa, is slightly misleading in the best way. Yes, it's about her rise. Yes, she becomes a queen in every sense. But the show is just as invested in everyone else's ascent. The way background characters who once flinched at the mention of a name start walking a little taller. The way old traditions are reinterpreted by people who never had a say before, that's the real climb. The ascent is communal, even if it's centered on her. At a certain point, I caught myself doing that thing I sometimes do with really immersive dramas. Pausing mid-episode to just sit there and imagine the world continuing off screen. What are the wolves in the far north saying about her new laws? How are young pups playing queen and council in their own version of house? That's when you know the storytelling has cracked open something big enough to live in your head rent-free. And of course, tucked underneath all the political intrigue and mythic imagery, there's the simple, raw through line of a woman grieving her mother. That never really goes away. Even as she gains power, allies, victories, there are these quiet moments where the camera catches her alone, looking up at the moon with this mix of anger and yearning. Sometimes she talks to her mother out loud. Sometimes she just breathes her name like a question. The show never gives you some neat, spiritual scene where mom appears and blesses everything. There's no tidy closure. Just a daughter who will always be partly that powerless child again, no matter how many laws she writes. In a weird way, that refusal to give her clean healing is what makes the empowerment feel earned. She's not fixed by becoming queen. Her trauma doesn't vanish in a burst of silver light. She builds something new out of the shards, and some of them still cut her. If you've ever gone back to a place that hurt you and tried to make it better for the next person, you'll recognize that messy combination of pride and pain. And just when you think the show has exhausted every possible angle on power, blood, and law, it throws one more quiet image at you. A child, not hers but of the kingdom, standing in a patch of moonlight, looking at their own unremarkable hands and smiling, Not because they see some glowing sign of favor, but because for the first time, they know it doesn't matter. The camera doesn't linger, doesn't make a speech of it. It just lets you see that and then cuts away. That's the spell this drama casts when it's at its best. It knows how to make a single, wordless shot feel like a manifesto. It also helps that the series has a very tactile sense of world. Even when we're not given endless exposition about the kingdom, you feel the texture of it. Stone corridors that hold old secrets. Clothing that signals allegiance. Ceremonies that look beautiful while hiding brutality. The show understands that a kingdom is an ecosystem of symbols. And if you want to change it, you have to change what people worship. My biggest praise is the emotional precision. The Queen isn't written as an empowerment poster. She's written as a person shaped by being rejected, and then forced to become dangerous enough to never be rejected again. That's a dark origin, and the show doesn't sanitize it. It lets her be cold. It lets her be strategic. It lets her be tired. It lets her be morally complicated without turning her into an anti-hero cliché. My biggest critique, if I'm going to be fair, is that the show occasionally luxuriates in its own atmosphere at the expense of momentum, and a couple of its political standoffs start to echo each other. I also think some side perspectives, especially the lives of ordinary people under these laws, could have been foregrounded more to amplify the weight of reform. But these are not fatal flaws. They're the kind of imperfections you notice because the core is so strong. If you're coming to this as a newcomer, you don't need to be a fantasy politics scholar to enjoy it. You just need to be willing to watch a story where victory isn't clean. If you're a fan of revenge narratives, you'll get your teeth. But you'll also get something rarer. The aftermath, the governance, the moral hangover. If you're a critic-type viewer who's tired of Destiny Girl Boss writing, this drama is a relief because it doesn't worship its protagonist. It interrogates her. And if you're someone who's ever felt like you had to become exceptional just to be treated as baseline human, I'm not going to lie, this show might hit you in a tender place. It hit me there. Not in a melodramatic, I'm sobbing on the floor way, but in that quiet, inconvenient way where you pause after an episode and realize your jaw has been clenched for an hour. What I remember most is the show's insistence that rewriting laws is an emotional act. It's an act of love for people you'll never meet. It's an act of rage against people who trained you to accept less. It's an act of grief for what was lost. And watching a character embody all three at once felt weirdly validating. So yes, I loved El Ascenso de la Reina Licántropa. I loved it because it trusted silence, it trusted faces, it trusted the slow dread of institutional resistance. I loved it because it let its queen be more than a slogan. It gave her a spine made of scars and a heart that never got to be young. If you want a neat comfort watch where the heroine wins and everyone claps and the world becomes fair in a day, this probably isn't your flavor. But if you want a drama that treats power like something heavy and reform like something costly, if you want a story that makes the crown feel like both prize and punishment, this is worth your time. And if you've been hanging out with me here on Flick Flair through this whole deep dive, thank you for letting me get a little intense about moonlit corridors and legal reform like it's my full-time job. Drop your read on the Queen in the comments. Did you see her more as a reformer, a avenger, or a survivor pretending those are separate? And I'll see you in the next one, still probably ranting about how the most dangerous monsters in fantasy are usually the ones who call themselves tradition.